Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into one of the most persistent and really fascinating technical paradoxes in all of military history. I mean, the head-to-head clash between the American M4 Sherman and the German Panzer V, the Panther, for decades, military enthusiasts, historians, they've all looked at the spec sheets, and they've basically concluded that this shouldn't have even been a contest.
That's the common wisdom, isn't it? Absolutely. When you compare them purely on the metrics, firepower, frontal armor thickness, speed, the Panther just seems like a technological leap. It really does. It was sleeker, definitely faster, and that high velocity 75 millimeter KWK-42 gun, I mean, it made it an absolute killer at long range. We're talking distances where the standard Sherman 75 millimeter cannon, it couldn't penetrate the Panther's sloped frontal plate. Not reliably. It truly represents the zenith of German engineering ambition in that mid-war period.
It absolutely does. And the accepted narrative, the story you always hear, says the Panther was practically untouchable, in one-on-one duel. Yet here's the historical outcome that just demands we look deeper. It really forces the question. By the end of 1945, the Panther tank, the supposed masterpiece, it was basically an engineering dead end, functionally retired, fading into history. But the humble, often mocked Sherman, it just kept rolling on. And we're not talking about a quick retirement either. The Sherman chassis remained a primary combat platform globally. I mean, well into the 1970s, you saw them in heavy action in the Middle East.
It's a profound contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Almost unbelievable when you just look at the numbers. And this is exactly why our mission today, this deep dive, it has to shift entirely away from just those raw technical specifications. We are going to try and determine exactly how the tank that was, on paper, technically inferior, the Sherman, how it fundamentally won the war. This means looking at system design, operational logistics, mechanical endurance, and really what it truly means to be the most effective tool in a war of that global scale.
Right. So we're asking, is the best machine really the one with the biggest numbers on its stat card? Or is it the one that can reliably show up to the fight day after brutal day, backed up by an unstoppable supply chain? That's the core question, I think.
Precisely. It's the system versus the individual component.
Let's start by defining the core DNA of these two machines, because they really were born out of completely divergent design mandates and different national industrial capabilities, too. When the United States finally mobilized for war, the mandate for the M4 Sherman, it wasn't about being superior in every single metric. Not at all. It was brutally practical, and it was focused on global reach. They needed a medium tank that prioritized basically three things: rapid mass production, ease of field repair, and critically global transportability.
And that requirement, global transportability, that fundamentally shaped the Sherman's maximum size and weight. You have to remember, the U.S. was fighting a war across two massive oceans. They had to ship these tanks on standardized U.S. Liberty ships, and these tanks had to fit within specific infrastructure limitations. Think about the carrying capacity of temporary bridges, pontoons, even just loading and unloading them in, undeveloped ports. The tank couldn't really exceed roughly 30 tons if it was going to be easily handled by the available equipment.
So the resulting design, it had moderate armor, okay, thick enough maybe to protect against most anti-tank guns of the time, but certainly not heavy enough to be invulnerable, especially not against those newer German guns. And an adequate main gun, the 75 millimeter. Effective against earlier German armor, sure, but it definitely didn't guarantee penetration against the newer, heavier Panthers and Tigers.
But that forced moderation, that compromise, it actually hit its greatest strength, which was reliability, efficiency, and industrial replicability. The U.S. prioritized standardized parts, simple cast steel construction, common components used across multiple factories. This approach, this focus, allowed them to produce almost 50,000 Shermans during the war. 50,000.
It's an interesting point, isn't it, that reliability is often seen as, well, kind of a boring feature, like a footnote next to horsepower and gun penetration stats.
Right.
But the Americans clearly understood they were fighting a different kind of war, a war of industrialized attrition, where the ability to just replenish losses and keep vehicles running, that was the main weapon, in a way.
Precisely. They optimized for quantity and, crucially, operational readiness, keeping tanks in the fight. The German side, however, was operating from a totally different mindset. They were reacting to a pretty devastating crisis.
You mean the famous technical shock, the psychological shock, too, on the Eastern Front, encountering the Soviet T-34 tank?
That's the trigger. Absolutely. When German Panzer units first met the P-34 with its, revolutionary sloped armor, its wide tracks giving it great mobility in mud and snow, and that long 76 millimeter gun, they suddenly realized their existing Panzer IIIs and even the Panzer IIIs were, frankly, hopelessly obsolete. or getting there very fast. The response from the German high command was immediate, it was urgent, and it was driven largely by Hitler's personal demand. He wanted a machine designed specifically to outgun and outlast any opponent. He wasn't primarily interested in mass production numbers at that point. He was interested in technical supremacy, dominance.
And that demand, that drive for technical perfection, it resulted in the Panther, the Panzer V. And we have to acknowledge it was a stunning piece of engineering for its time.
Yeah.
It looked the part. It successfully adopted the T-34's key feature, that sloped armor, but combined it with absolutely devastating German optics and, of course, that incredible 75mm KWK-42 gun.
That gun really is the cornerstone of German philosophy here. It had exceptional muzzle velocity. This meant it was capable of hitting and destroying a Sherman from, well, over 1.5 kilometers away, maybe 1,500 meters plus. So, theoretically, the Panther crew could pick off an American tank unit before the Shermans could even effectively traverse their turrets and fire an accurate return shot. The initial calculus, on paper, favored the German tank every single time.
So, okay, on one side you have the American philosophy, reliable, simple, built for volume, built for global deployment, get it there, keep it running. On the other side, the German philosophy, technologically superior, demanding perfection, focused laser-like on overwhelming killing power.
In this ambition, this relentless demand for cutting-edge technology and perfection, especially under the extreme pressure of a losing war, it introduced catastrophic complexity, just layer upon layer. That complexity became the terrible cost of that perceived superiority. It set up the fundamental failure points that ultimately doomed the Panther in the field. The faster, harder-hitting machine, paradoxically, became the fragile machine.
Okay, let's move from the drawing board, from the theory, to the actual mud and grit of the European battlefield. Because this is really where the theoretical superiority of the Panther just completely collapsed. We have to talk about the complexity that made the Panther a true mechanic's nightmare. That phrase comes up again and again.
It really does. It was like a cascading series of complex components, each one pushing the limits of the available technology, and maybe more importantly, the available materials Germany had access to by then. Get the suspension system, for instance. The Panther used a very complex overlapping set of road wheels. It's known as the Schachtlaufwerk suspension system. It was supported by intricate torsion bars. Now this system, it offered phenomenal cross-country mobility. It really did. It distributed the tank's immense 45-ton weight very effectively.
Superior ride quality, better mobility off-road. Okay, sounds good on paper. Advantages.
It does sound good. But what happened in reality when just a single road wheel or maybe a torsion bar was damaged? Say, by a mine or an artillery shell fragment. Because of that overlapping design, the repair crews often had to dismantle several of the outer wheels just to get access to repair the inner ones. Field maintenance suddenly became this massive logistical undertaking. It often required specialized, heavy recovery vehicles, things like the Bulge Panther recovery tank itself. And it took far, far more time than the Americans typically spent fixing an entire Sherman engine, for example.
So basically, every element that was designed for superior performance actually ended up maximizing the tank's downtime when things went wrong, which they inevitably do in combat.
Exactly.
But if we had to pinpoint the single most catastrophic failure point, the one component that truly crippled the Panther's operational availability, where does the evidence point most strongly?
It points squarely, overwhelmingly at the final drive, no question. This is the intricate gear system, right? It transfers the immense torque and horsepower from the engine and the transmission out to the drive sprockets, which then move the tracks. Now, due to the high weight of the Panther, that 45 tons, and the demand for speed and quick acceleration, plus the immense strain of high-performance cornering and maneuvering, this component was just fundamentally overstressed. It couldn't take the punishment.
How often are we talking about these failures occurring? Is this like an occasional issue or?
Yeah. Oh, no, not occasional. In the operational reports, particularly those coming out of late 1944 and into 1945, the failure rate was appalling, just terrible. The final drives often failed catastrophically after only a few hundred miles of operation. Sometimes, reports indicate as little as 150 kilometers. That's less than 100 miles. And when that final drive failed, the tank was completely immobilized, dead in the water. Plus, you have to layer on the fact that as the war progressed, Germany faced critical shortages of strategic materials, especially the high-grade alloys like molybdenum needed for precision gear manufacturing. This meant that later production Panthers often used lower-quality steel, sometimes improperly hardened steel. And this just exacerbated the fragility of those absolutely crucial transmission and final drive components.
A few hundred miles. sometimes just 150 kilometers. That is barely the distance of a single tactical advance. So you're telling me that a Panther unit, say, moving up to reinforce a critical sector of the front line, might realistically lose half its strength, not even to enemy fire, but simply to mechanical breakdown on the way there.
That is precisely the case. It happened time and time again. Contemporary German operational analysis, their own internal reports, confirms that mechanical losses often dramatically outweighed combat losses for Panther units. In many engagements, especially later in the war, far more Panthers were abandoned and subsequently destroyed by their own crews because they were immobilized and couldn't be recovered than were actually knocked out by Allied fire. So the most powerful tank on the battlefield, arguably, was spending more time broken down by the side of the road waiting for specialized repair crews and equipment than it was actually engaging the enemy. It's incredible.
What's really fascinating here, as you said, is that direct connection between the ambition for superior speed and power and the resulting fragility. The designers demanded top-tier performance, which required these incredibly complex, high-strain parts. But the industrial base, under wartime pressure and resource constraints, simply couldn't consistently produce parts capable of sustaining that kind of usage.
It's the classic Achilles heel of technological idealism, isn't it? You aim for perfection, this perfect weapon, without fully factoring in the messy, brutal reality of battlefield maintenance, material constraints, crew training, and continuous grinding combat usage. The German requirement for technical supremacy inadvertently sabotaged the operational availability of their main tank force.
Okay, let's pivot back then to the Sherman, which, as we've established, was designed under almost the opposite philosophy. If the Panther was this fragile, temperamental, thoroughbred racehorse, the Sherman was more like the durable, utilitarian Clydesdale workhorse.
Exactly. The Sherman was fundamentally designed for the field. It prioritized operational readiness, keeping tanks running above almost everything else. Its engine and transmission systems were deliberately simplified and standardized. The U.S. Army standardized very early on the Continental R975 gasoline engine. Now, this was actually an aircraft engine adapted for tank use. And while, yes, it consumed more fuel than some later diesel variants the Soviets used, it was incredibly easy to maintain. And critically, it was easy to swap out in the field.
I remember reading some anecdotes about the speed of that maintenance. Can you share some specifics on just how quickly they could, say, replace an engine?
Absolutely. The Sherman's entire power pack engine and transmission together could be disconnected and literally pulled out of the engine compartment in under an hour by a trained crew, using just standard field recovery equipment like a tank retriever vehicle's crane. A completely new, field-ready power pack could then be installed and connected up in just a few hours more. This modularity, this plug-and-play approach was absolutely key. When a Sherman broke down with a major engine or transmission issue, it wasn't necessarily a week-long ordeal involving a massive recovery effort back to a depot workshop. It was often a relatively quick component swap near the front lines. Contrast that with the Panther, where swapping the engine or transmission often required specialized field workshops, heavy lifting gear, and days, literally days of intensive effort.
That simplicity, that focus on rapid repair, it must have been an intangible but absolutely crucial factor in wartime morale for the crews, wouldn't you think?
Oh, immensely so. It brings confidence. Knowing that if your machine takes a hit, or even if it just breaks down from wear and tear, the mechanics have a really good chance of getting you back in the fight quickly. That changes everything about how you approach combat. And we have that specific, very illustrative quote from a U.S. Army mechanic who was operating in France. He said, "The Sherman may not scare the Germans, but it never scares us."
Wow, that quote is just so powerful because it perfectly summarizes that psychological divide, doesn't it? The Panther instilled fear in the enemy at range, sure, but the Sherman instilled absolute confidence and resilience in its own crew. The crew knew their machine probably wouldn't betray them through needless complexity, and just as importantly, they knew they had the logistical backup and the mechanical simplicity needed to fix it if something did go wrong.
That's the fundamental difference, isn't it? It's a difference between a brittle, high-performance race car designed for maybe one perfect sprint and a durable, simple vehicle designed to cross a continent multiple times under harsh conditions and keep going.
Right. Theory is great, spec sheets are interesting, but the ultimate validation of any design philosophy happens on the battlefield, under fire. And that clash really came to a head shortly after the Normandy breakout, in the summer and fall of 1944. Particularly during the ferocious fighting around the Battle of Arracourt in France in September 44.
Arracourt serves as, well, almost the textbook historical moment. It's where the systemic advantages of the Allied approach conclusively overcame the raw technical superiority of the German machines. The stage was set. American tankers of the 4th Armored Division, part of General George S. Patton's hard-charging forces, ran straight into a large counterattack force. This was composed mainly of German Panther units from the 5th Panzer Army, led by the experienced General Hasso von Manteuffel.
And we know the immediate tactical situation wasn't great for the Americans, right? There was heavy fog, which neutralized long-range optics for both sides to some extent. But the Panthers still had that lethal gun. They still had superior frontal armor protection. On paper, they should have had the advantage in any direct engagement that occurred.
They certainly did fire first in many cases. The Panthers were absolutely capable of penetrating the Sherman's frontal armor from ranges and angles where the Sherman's standard 75mm gun just couldn't respond effectively. It couldn't punch through the Panther's sloped glacis plate. But here's where it gets really interesting. This is where the system kicks in. The American crews had doctrine, they had training, and crucially, they had communication systems that turned their individual tanks not just into single fighting vehicles, but into a lethal, flexible, coordinated system, a team.
Let's talk specifics on that coordination. What exactly allowed the Sherman crews to function so effectively as a unit, while the German crews, despite their individual tanks' brilliance, were often more isolated on the battlefield?
It really starts with radio communication. Almost every single American Sherman tank was equipped with this superb VHF, very high-frequency radio set, the SCR 508 or similar variants. This allowed tank commanders to speak clearly, instantaneously, and reliably to every other tank in their platoon, their company, even their battalion command. And just as importantly, they could talk directly to supporting infantry and, critically, to artillery forward observers. The Germans, by contrast, had much more inconsistent radio communication down to the individual tank or platoon level. They often relied on older, less reliable AM radio systems and frequently prioritized installing the best radio equipment only in command vehicles, not every single tank.
So the Shermans were operating almost like a highly functional football team, able to call plays instantly, react to the defense together, while the Panthers were more like a collection of brilliant but somewhat disconnected soloists.
That's a great analogy, exactly. When a Panther opened fire, often revealing its position, the Shermans, thanks to their agility and that instant radio communication, could react almost immediately as a group. They weren't fighting alone. They quickly learned through hard experience that you just couldn't reliably take on a Panther head-on and expect to win. It was suicidal. So the Sherman's relative speed and maneuverability helped significantly by better crew training that emphasized aggressive flanking tactics, allowed them to rapidly reposition. They'd use terrain, use smoke, and try to attack the Panther's much thinner side or rear armor where their 75mm gun was effective.
And the fog at Arracourt, which you might think would favor the slower, more heavily armored vehicle, actually seemed to play into the hands of the quicker, more coordinated units.
It absolutely did. It neutralized the Panther's primary advantage, its ability to dominate the battlefield at extreme long ranges using its superior gun and optics. When the fog forced the fighting into much closer quarters, say 300 meters or less, the Sherman's lower velocity 75mm gun was still quite effective, especially against the Panther's vulnerable side armor. And the ability of maybe 3 or 4 Shermans to coordinate a simultaneous attack from different angles using those radios made even the superior German tank incredibly vulnerable, overwhelmed it.
The final outcome of the Battle of Arracourt is just staggering when you look at the numbers. In just one key day of fighting, the 4th Armored Division, relying primarily on M4 Shermans, they destroyed over 40 German tanks, the vast majority of which were Panthers and Panzerdivisie, while suffering comparatively minimal losses themselves. Something like 14 Shermans lost, I believe.
That's right. It was a crushing tactical defeat for the technically superior machine. But crucially, it wasn't just about tank versus tank. This is where we absolutely must integrate General Eisenhower's later observation. He noted that American training, logistics, and overall adaptability had consistently outweighed German firepower. The U.S. system brought immediate, overwhelming combined arm support to bear. When a Sherman platoon spotted a Panther, or a group of Panthers, they didn't just engage on their own. They immediately called in artillery fire, often receiving devastatingly accurate barrages within minutes, which served multiple purposes. It would suppress the target area, confuse the German crews, maybe damage optics or tracks, and force them into hasty maneuvers. And hasty maneuvers in a Panther. That put immense strain on those fragile final drive systems we talked about, and often exposed their thinner side armor to waiting Sherman guns.
This really is the crucial lesson, isn't it? The one we need to underline for everyone listening. The specification sheet for the individual piece of hardware becomes almost meaningless if the system surrounding that machine is broken or inferior.
Yes. The so what here is monumental. It changes how you think about military hardware, or any complex system, really. A tank is just one component, a node in a complex, interconnected war machine. Wars are not won by isolated acts of technical brilliance or the single best weapon. They are won by the unseen, often unglamorous, but absolutely critical non-tank factors. This includes the sheer volume of fuel the U.S. logistical tail could deliver right to the front lines, the standardized supply of spare parts that, for the most part, never failed, the highly trained recovery and repair crews who could get disabled Shermans back into the fight sometimes within hours, not days or weeks, and the doctrine, the training that encouraged aggressive maneuver warfare and seamless combined armed support from artillery and air power. Think about it. A broken-down Panther, even with its powerful gun and thick armor, is just stationary scrap metal waiting to be destroyed or captured. But a quickly repaired Sherman, even with its adequate gun, is an immediate, mobile, lethal threat that becomes part of a system that never stops moving forward. That's the difference.
Okay, so if the battlefield reports from 1944 and 45 left any lingering doubts about these systemic flaws in the Panther design, the Allies' post-war deep dive studies just erased them completely, didn't they? Once they had dozens of captured operational Panthers under controlled test conditions, away from the chaos of battle, the true story really emerged.
Oh, absolutely. They were intensely curious. They wanted to know definitively if this incredible German technology, that sloped armor concept, the high-velocity gun, the superior optics, was this the blueprint for the future of tank design? Should everyone copy the Panther? The French army in particular undertook a highly detailed, very systematic analysis. They'd captured quite a few Panthers and even put some into service briefly. Their study culminated in the 1947 Le Panther report, and this wasn't just based on battlefield rumors or anecdotes from crews. This was systematic engineering analysis, metallurgical testing, teardowns, cold, hard data.
And what were the definitive findings of that cold, hard analytical report? Did it confirm the field reports?
It absolutely did. The French report systematically documented repeated, specific mechanical and metallurgical failures across the board. They confirmed the fundamental inadequacy of the final drives, noting not just the design issues, but also the poor quality of the materials often used in later production runs. They found the gears simply couldn't handle the high strain imposed by the tank's immense weight and powerful engine over sustained use. They also cited consistent recurring issues with the complex steering gears and the main transmissions. They stated bluntly that the tank required a level of maintenance far beyond the typical capacity of field repair crews, needing depot-level work far too frequently.
So the final conclusion wasn't ambiguous at all, was it?
Not in the slightest. The definitive conclusion of the French Army's meticulous study was that the Panther was, and I quote loosely here but capture the essence, too complicated, too fragile for sustained combat operations. It was seen as a vehicle designed for a hypothetical, decisive, short-term tactical victory, a knockout punch, that Germany, by that stage of the war, was never actually capable of achieving on a strategic scale. It was brilliant engineering in isolation, perhaps, but strategically unsound for the war they were actually fighting.
And this documented failure stands in just stark contrast to the incredible endurance and the truly global legacy of the M4 Sherman. While the Panther was being shelved, essentially becoming a technical curiosity in military museums, the Sherman was just hitting its stride as a universal, adaptable workhorse around the world.
The adaptability of that basic, reliable Sherman chassis is honestly astonishing. It really proved the long-term value of prioritizing design simplicity and robustness from the outset. The most famous example of this longevity, of course, is its extensive service in the Middle East, particularly with the Israeli Defense Forces. Because the Sherman chassis was so fundamentally simple and mechanically robust, it became almost like a blank canvas for modernization programs decades after its introduction.
Right, you're referring specifically to the Israeli upgrades in the 1950s and into the 60s, the ones that led to the legendary M51, which is commonly known as the Super Sherman.
Exactly that. The Israelis performed some truly remarkable engineering surgery on those old Sherman hulls. They recognized that the Sherman's main problem by the 1960s was primarily firepower, not its fundamental mechanical integrity or mobility. So they adapted the reliable chassis by fitting them with powerful new engines, often switching to more efficient diesel power plants, and most spectacularly, by figuring out how to integrate the extremely potent, high-velocity French 105mm CN-105 F1 gun into the Sherman turret.
Now that sounds like a massive technical challenge. How on earth did they manage to fit a huge gun, designed for a much larger, more modern tank like the French AMX-30, into the relatively narrow turret ring of a World War II-era Sherman?
It required immense engineering ingenuity, no doubt. They had to heavily modify the gun itself, including shortening the barrel slightly to manage the recoil forces inside the cramped turret space. And then they had to fit these massive, distinctive counterweights to the rear of the turret bustle just to balance the new, much heavier cannon. It looked quite unique. But the effort absolutely paid off. This M51 Super Sherman, based on a core design philosophy from 1941, was still considered operationally effective 2 decades later. It was deployed successfully against much more modern, Soviet-supplied tanks fielded by Arab armies. We're talking about encounters with Egyptian T-54s, even the T-62s, during the pivotal 1967 Six-Day War.
Just think about that for a moment. A tank platform that was sometimes mocked as inadequate back in 1944 was still successfully engaging main battle tanks designed in the mid-1950s and early 1960s. That just highlights the profound robustness and foresight of the original U.S. design mandate, doesn't it? It was built with enough inherent structural and mechanical redundancy, enough simplicity to allow for decades of adaptation and upgrading.
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, the Panther, built specifically to be technically superior for its time, was retired almost immediately after World War II ended and never saw combat again.
The contrast couldn't be more definitive. One design, the Sherman, proved that simplicity, flexibility, and above all reliability equal longevity and enduring utility. The other design, the Panther, proved that the relentless pursuit of maximum, high-specification complexity, especially if it undermines fundamental stability and maintainability, leads only to immediate obsolescence once the specific narrow conditions it was designed for disappear.
So let's try to synthesize everything we've covered now. All the technical limitations, the maintenance nightmares, the battlefield outcomes. We really have to redefine what the word better truly means in a strategic military context, maybe even in a broader sense. The Panther was undeniably a masterpiece of engineering in many ways, perhaps the most sophisticated tank design produced during the war, but ultimately it was a profound failure of operational practicality.
Couldn't agree more. Conversely, the Sherman was modest. It was often looked down upon, certainly never won any beauty contests with its boxy appearance. But it worked. It delivered consistent operational availability day in, day out. And critically, it was available in massive, almost overwhelming numbers, thanks directly to its simple design and that incredibly efficient standardized manufacturing process the U.S. implemented.
It really seems the historian's final assessment we mentioned earlier perfectly captures the core lesson here. Let me find it again. Yes. The Sherman didn't win because it was the best tank. It won because it was the best tool for the kind of war America fought.
That statement just encapsulates the strategic reality perfectly. The United States was fighting a war of unprecedented global scale, requiring immense industrial output and relying on rapid maneuver warfare across vast, geographically dispersed theaters. They didn't need a weapon that was hypothetically superior 10% of the time in a perfect long-range duel scenario. They needed a reliable tool that was available and fighting 90% of the time, that could be fixed relatively easily by field mechanics with standard tools, and that could be delivered reliably across thousands of miles of ocean without sinking the transport ships due to excessive weight or size.
And this insight shifts our focus beyond just military history, doesn't it? It really pushes into the realm of critical design thinking. It's a lesson that feels applicable to any sustained, complex operation, whether you're talking about technology development, running a business, or building infrastructure.
Absolutely. It powerfully suggests that success in any long-term, high-stress endeavor is usually not achieved by seeking out perfect, but perhaps brittle, machines or solutions. Instead, success is won by reliable, resilient systems. It's won by the endurance of the operating crews, the people on the ground, who can trust their equipment day after day without constant fear of breakdown. It's won by the factories and supply chains that can rapidly replace losses without requiring impossibly tight manufacturing tolerances or exotic materials.
And maybe above all, it's won by those relentless logistics systems that just never stop moving. The ones ensuring that fuel, spare parts, and ammunition are always flowing to the point of friction, keeping the whole system operational.
Exactly. The pursuit of the absolute best specification on paper often completely ignores the total cost. And I don't just mean money. I mean the cost in terms of the maintenance infrastructure required, the specialized skill sets needed for repair, the training burden, and the inevitable operational reality of high-stress environments where things will break. The Germans, with the Panther, were arguably designing for the perfect engagement, that ultimate decisive knockout blow. The Americans, with the Sherman, were designing for the long haul, for the entire campaign. Knowing that the ability to absorb punishment, repair quickly, and keep coming back for the next round is the true measure of strategic superiority. The Sherman really stands as a monument to the principle that operational availability, just being there and being ready, is almost always the ultimate metric of success, far outweighing theoretical peak performance.
It's true. The Panther's shadow still looms large in history, doesn't it? It remains this compelling symbol of technological brilliance, ambition, maybe even hubris. It naturally draws our admiration for its design.
It does. It's an impressive machine to look at. But the Sherman, I think, offers us a deeper, perhaps more sobering, but ultimately more valuable truth. Victory, and maybe more importantly, enduring success in any complex field, tends to favor those who build not just for glory, not for that single perfect specification sheet, but for relentless endurance and realistic, grounded practicality.
The Panther was beautiful, sleek, and terrifying on paper. The Sherman was, well, kind of ugly, boxy, and fundamentally simple. But the Sherman won the war, and its legacy lasted for decades longer, shaping conflicts long after the Panther was forgotten outside of museums. That really should give you pause, maybe make you think, when you're assessing the tools, the systems, the strategies you rely on in your own life and work. Sometimes, maybe often, the most modest, reliable choice is actually the most strategically sound. Choose endurance over spectacle.